Chapter 1. The Letter Opener. The letter opener lay on Edmund Pargeter's desk at a slight angle, the way a thing gets left when the hand that placed it was thinking of something else. Brass handle, plain as a door latch. The blade, silver-plated, worn nearly to the steel at the tip from 31 years of correspondence. Miss Marple noticed it the moment Mrs. Hadley showed her into the estate office, and she noticed, with the quiet, unhurried attention that passed in her for mere politeness, what was not beside it. Gone. A rectangle of paler leather on the left side of the blotter, faintly different in color, slightly less tarnished by the tobacco smoke that had worked itself into every surface in this wing of the house over the decades. Something had stood there, long enough to leave its shape behind, not so long ago that the shape had begun to disappear. She filed the observation away, tucked it like a bit of careful hemming into the back of her mind, and turned her attention to Edmund Pargeter himself. He sat behind the desk with the particular solidity of a man who had occupied the same chair for so long that he and it had reached some arrangement with each other. 60, or thereabouts. Sandy hair gone grey at the temples, and thinner than it had any right to be, given his obvious vigour. He wore a tweed waistcoat in spite of the central heating. The boiler in the east wing was clearly a source of some private resentment, and across the waistcoat ran a brass watch chain, looped twice through the second buttonhole, thick as a finger. His hands on the desk were very still. Men who kept their hands still like that, in Miss Marple's experience, were either genuinely calm or working very hard at appearing so. Miss Marple. He stood, and the chair scraped back hard enough to mark the floor. Lady Ashford mentioned you'd be arriving this week. The 3 o'clock train, she agreed. Very punctual. I was almost unprepared. He did not smile. Lady Ashford is at the Dower House. She finds the hall unsettling, given the sale. Quite understandable. Miss Marple glanced around the office. Full bookshelves, a filing cabinet with one drawer not fully closed, a window looking onto the stable yard. The stable yard was empty. Had been empty for years, she suspected. There was a particular quality to the stone flags, the way moss had reclaimed them in patterns that required more than one wet season to establish. You've been steward here a long time, Mr. Pargeter. 31 years. It must be difficult. Something crossed his face. Not grief exactly, and not satisfaction either. A sort of settled waiting, like bread dough left to prove. He said, "The estate must be sold. Death duties don't wait on sentiment." "No," said Miss Marple. "They don't." She was shown to her room by a housemaid whose name she didn't catch, a girl of perhaps 17, grey uniform, grey expression, clearly counting the days until she could find a position in town. The room was in the west corridor, with a window facing the kitchen garden and, beyond the kitchen garden's grey stone wall, the beginning of the home wood. Cold. The radiator ticked, but produced little warmth. The bed was made with the military precision of a woman who had spent 30 years making beds in houses where standards were still enforced, which meant Mrs. Hadley was responsible. The towels were thick, but slightly damp, which told Miss Marple the airing cupboard was failing. She pressed her palm flat against the towel for a moment. She did this sometimes, applied her hand to things, as if reading them, and she had never quite been able to explain it to anyone's satisfaction, including her own. Perhaps because texture told the truth more readily than expressions did. The damp towel said, "Money is very short, has been for some time, and the small things are the first to show it." She changed out of her travelling clothes and went down for tea. Chapter 2. 6 at dinner. They were 6 at dinner, and the dining room had been shut since spring, and still held the cold of it in the panelling. Lady Honoria Ashford sat at the head of the table. Not the Honoria of 40 years ago, naturally, but recognizably that woman's close relative. 75, erect as a doorframe, white hair, dressed with an effort that spoke of assistance received. She wore a grey wool shawl over her evening gown. She had always felt the cold, even as a girl, which Miss Marple remembered perfectly well from the school at Eastbourne, where they had both been miserable for 2 winters and friends for rather longer. She took both Miss Marple's hands in the drawing-room before dinner, and her grip was firm and dry and very cold. "Jane," a pause, the kind of pause that carries weight. "It's good of you to come." "It's good to have somewhere to come," said Miss Marple, which was both kind and accurate. Marjorie Ashford managed the practical business of the table, reseating people, summoning the housemaid, discovering the claret was not where it should be. She was 52, the widow of Honoria's son Robert, who had died of his heart 4 years ago, and she wore her widowhood with the ease of a garment that had turned out, against all expectation, to fit rather well. Dark hair, a manner that was brisk without being unkind. She looked at Edmund Pargeter when he took his seat with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read, not hostility, not familiarity, but something watchful. A cook watching a pot she doesn't entirely trust. James Ashford was 28 and awkward about it. He sat between his grandmother and the window, ate his soup with concentration, and answered questions with the cheerful brevity of a young man who had decided that the safest conversational strategy was to say as little as possible. He was good-looking in the way that certain families sometimes produce without meaning to, the genes tidying up after several indifferent generations. He kept glancing at the door. "We are expecting Mr. Bellamy," Lady Ashford said, to no one in particular. "Bellamy," said Miss Marple. "The valuer. Harker and Sons in London sent him. Apparently, he is very highly regarded for this period." She did not name the period, as if naming it might make the sale more real. "He is cataloguing the library contents this week." Charles Bellamy arrived at 8:10, full of apologies and rain. He was 45, heavily built, with the kind of face that had been handsome in its 30s and was now merely solid. His overcoat was very good, and he took it off in the hall with the careful respect of a man who had not always owned good overcoats. He looked at Edmund Pargeter across the dinner table, and Edmund Pargeter looked back, and neither of them said a word for a long moment. 2 pots, set side by side on the same range, both coming to the boil, neither touching the other, both entirely aware. Miss Marple noticed this and said nothing, which was one of her more useful skills. Dr. Winterton arrived last, with apologies of a different sort, not rain, but a patient. He was 78, and he had the lean, dry look of a man who had used himself hard and carefully and was not yet finished. He patted Honoria Ashford's hand when he sat beside her, and she patted his back. The exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds and said, in Miss Marple's estimation, quite a great deal. She could not have explained what exactly it said, and she would not try, not yet. But she felt it, the same way she felt a draught from a window that looked perfectly closed. Something present that declared itself through its own careful containment. The conversation at dinner was careful. That was the word for it, careful. The way pastry is careful, all cold surfaces and deliberate handling, because warmth would ruin it. They talked about the sale, and the weather, and a television program Miss Marple had not seen. Edmund Pargeter said almost nothing. He ate and he watched, and once, when James Ashford laughed at something Dr. Winterton said, he looked at the young man with an expression of such calm and specific knowledge that Miss Marple found herself setting down her fork. She picked it up again. She said, "This is a beautiful room." "It was," said Lady Ashford. After dinner, in the drawing-room, over coffee that was too weak and biscuits that were too sweet, Miss Marple sat near the fire and listened to the house. Old houses spoke, not in any supernatural sense, but in the practical one. Drafts told you where windows didn't fit. Creaks told you the load-bearing points. Silences told you which rooms were used and which were not, and roughly for how long. This house had many silences, and they were of several different kinds. The silence of rooms closed for economy, the silence of conversations stopped at the sound of footsteps, and, underneath both of those, a harder silence, the kind that grows up between people who have known each other too long and too well to say the thing that actually needs saying. She was in bed by 10, with her hot water bottle and a trollop she had already read twice. The radiator ticked. Outside, rain had begun again, tapping the window with a persistence that was almost conversational. She lay still, hands flat against the cold sheets, feeling the temperature seep up through linen, thinking about what was not on Edmund Pargeter's desk, and about the way Charles Bellamy had looked at Edmund Pargeter when he thought no one was watching, and about the expression on Edmund Pargeter's face when James Ashford laughed. A man who holds a secret, Miss Marple thought, holds it the way a gardener holds a very sharp tool, carefully, always aware of what it could do to anyone who got close enough. She turned out the light. Rain. Chapter 3. The Library Fire. Mrs. Hadley found him at 7:30. She came to tell Miss Marple about it herself, which said something, not about the relationship between the two women who had only met the previous afternoon, but about Mrs. Hadley's understanding of what the household now required. A woman of 60 who has managed a country house for 31 years develops a precise instinct for which person in any given gathering of people is actually in charge, regardless of title. She came to Miss Marple's door at 8:20, knocked twice with the flat of her hand rather than her knuckles, a practical knock, not a polite one, and said through the wood, "Mr. Pargeter is dead, ma'am, in the library." Miss Marple was already dressed. She had been awake since 6. The library was on the ground floor, east side, with a door from the main hall and a second door, narrower, green-painted, that connected through the gun room to the back passage. Edmund Pargeter lay face down on the hearthrug, which was turkey red and badly worn at the centre, and had absorbed a great deal of blood with the patient efficiency of old wool. His left arm was extended. His right arm was tucked beneath him. He still wore his tweed waistcoat. The brass watch chain lay loose against the hearthrug beside him, detached, which was odd, not broken, unclipped, as if someone had handled it deliberately, or as if it had caught on something in the fall. Miss Marple stood in the doorway and looked at this for a long moment, long enough that Mrs. Hadley, behind her, gave a small sound, not distress exactly, but the particular exhalation of a woman reaching the edge of what she can manage. "Who else knows?" Miss Marple said. "Only me, ma'am. I came straight to you." "Good. Go and ring for the police, and then perhaps put the kettle on." She paused. "Don't tell anyone else yet. Give me a moment." Mrs. Hadley went. Her footsteps were very rapid and very controlled, the stride of a woman keeping herself together through sheer force of habit. Miss Marple moved into the room. She did not go near the body. She was not a doctor, and she had no desire to disturb what a doctor and an inspector would later need to see undisturbed. She stood at the edge of the turkey-red rug and looked at the hearth. The fire had burned low, but not entirely out, which told her it had been set yesterday evening and had been burning for some hours. The grate was full of ash. On the mantelpiece above, 2 candlesticks, Georgian, silver, and a gap between them where a third item had stood. She could see its outline in the dust of the mantelpiece, a round base, slightly larger than the candlestick bases. A third candlestick. Brass, she thought, without knowing why she was certain. The other 2 were silver, yes, but silver paired with brass was common in houses that had sold their silver piecemeal and replaced it with cheaper substitutes when no one was looking. The dust shadow was larger than a silver candlestick base, a heavier thing, gone. She looked at Edmund Pargeter's head. She looked at the hearthrug around it. She did not look for long. Then she turned and looked at the door, the main hall door through which she had entered. The handle was brass, old, with a small nick in the plate where something had struck it once and left its mark. She turned to look at the other door, the green-painted one. It was ajar, no more than 2 inches. She did not touch it. She went out to wait for the police. Chapter 4. What isn't there? Inspector Foster arrived from Maidstone at 9:30. A square, deliberate man of 50, who looked at Miss Marple with the patient wariness of someone who had encountered helpful elderly ladies before and was not yet certain whether to be grateful or cautious. He was accompanied by a sergeant whose name was Crisp, which suited him. The household assembled in the drawing room, wrapped in various states of shock. Shock has textures, Miss Marple had always found. Some people wore it like a cold flannel pressed to the face, others like an ill-fitting coat they kept adjusting. Marjorie Ashford's shock was the flannel kind. She sat, with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on the fireplace, with an expression of such rigid composure that it must have been exhausting to maintain. James Ashford paced. He was not the sort of young man built for sitting still under pressure, and no one asked him to be. Lady Ashford had been collected from the dower house by the housemaid and now sat in her chair by the window, the one she always used, presumably because her hands went to the arms of it with the automatic confidence of long habit. She was very grey this morning, not just her hair. Dr. Winterton sat beside her. He held his hat in his hands, a grey felt hat, old, very clean, and turned the brim slowly with his fingers, round and round. Miss Marple watched his hands. They were steady, which was remarkable. Old hands, the knuckles slightly enlarged by decades of weather and work, but steady as a surgeon's, which, she supposed, they once had been. Charles Bellamy stood near the door with his arms at his sides, looking at no one, which was itself a kind of looking. Inspector Foster took statements in the small morning room, one by one. Miss Marple went forth, told him what she had observed, the dust shadow on the mantelpiece, the detached watch chain, the green door ajar, and watched his face as he wrote it down. He was a good inspector, she thought. He wrote everything, and he did not tell her she was wrong to mention it. The watch chain, he said. It was unclipped, not torn or broken. Someone handled it. Thief. An odd time for theft, and an odd item to choose, when there were 2 silver candlesticks within arm's reach. In any case, it was still there, lying beside him. It hadn't been taken. He looked at her. Then why unhook it? I don't know, said Miss Marple. But it's interesting, isn't it? She was released, and went not back to the drawing room, but to the kitchen, where Mrs. Hadley was keeping herself busy with a vigour that suggested the alternative to busyness was something she did not intend to permit. The kitchen smelled of tea and burned toast, someone's breakfast abandoned at the sound of bad news, and the grey morning light came in flat across the stone floor. Flat. Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table and said, Mrs. Hadley, last night, was there a tea tray taken to the library? Mrs. Hadley set down the pot she was scrubbing. Mr. Pargeter liked a tray at 9 o'clock. Milk, 2 biscuits. I sent Mary with it. And Mary came back with a pause, the kind of pause that is not hesitation, but recollection, which feels different to the hands, less slippery. She came back with the tray, Mrs. Hadley said slowly. The biscuits were still on it, untouched. I thought he'd just been busy and forgotten. It happens. Or he'd already gone, said Miss Marple. By 9 o'clock. She rose and thanked Mrs. Hadley and walked through the back passage, past the row of brass hooks where the outdoor keys hung, numbered on little white china labels, and stopped. She counted the hooks, counted the keys. 1 hook empty. The label read KG, which meant nothing immediately. She turned to find Mrs. Hadley had followed her, and was watching with the expression of someone who has noticed something she'd decided not to notice. KG, said Miss Marple. Kitchen garden. The housekeeper's voice was entirely flat. Gate in the north wall, it leads to the lane. And that key was there yesterday morning. I dusted the board after breakfast. A breath. I always do. Gone. Miss Marple went to stand at the window at the end of the back passage, looking out across the grey kitchen garden. The grey stone wall, the gate in the north wall, which from this distance she could see was, yes, not fully closed, moving slightly in the morning wind, a slow and patient swinging, the way a thing moves when it has been set in motion and there is no one left to stop it. Unlocked from the inside. Opened, not closed behind whoever had used it, She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass of the window. A person leaving in haste does not pause to lock a gate behind them. A person leaving calmly, returning to a place they had every right to be, does. Which told her the garden gate had not been used by someone escaping. It had been used by someone who, in the moment of using it, had been interrupted or distracted, or simply, for the first time in a very careful evening, careless. She stood there for a long while, feeling the cold travel from the glass into her fingers, thinking about care and carelessness, and the thin distance between them. She thought of her neighbour Mrs. Tilling, who had crocheted beautifully for 50 years and only ever made one error, a dropped stitch in a christening blanket, and how that single lapse, in Mrs. Tilling's own words, was the only thing anyone ever mentioned. One careless moment, one missing thing. She turned from the window and went to find Inspector Foster. Chapter 5. The Dower House. The Dower House was a 10-minute walk across the park, and the park was wet. Miss Marple did not mind wet grass. She had walked across enough of it in her life to have developed a philosophical position on the subject. But she minded the particular cold of an October morning in Kent, which worked its way in at the collar and the cuffs and settled into the joints with the cheerful efficiency of a very unwelcome house-guest. She wore her good wool coat, her stoutest shoes, and the expression she kept for situations requiring both directness and considerable tact. Lady Ashford had retreated from the hall to the Dower House 2 years ago, and the Dower House had, over those 2 years, become entirely her. It was smaller than the hall, manageable, which the hall had not been for 20 years, with low ceilings and a sitting room that smelled of chrysanthemums and wood ash, and the faint, particular ghost of a perfume Miss Marple recognized at once, though she could not have named it. Honoria. It was Honoria's room. Arranged, selected, held. The hall had been assembled by generations. This was a single woman's careful editing of herself. Miss Marple took it all in as she sat down, the way you read a letter before you comment on it. "You saw him," Honoria said. It was not a question. "I was first to the library after Mrs. Hadley, yes." "How?" A breath drawn in, held, released slowly. "Was it quick?" "I believe so." Honoria Ashford sat with her hands folded in her lap. Grey wool skirt, grey shawl, the same one she had worn at dinner, and her eyes on the fire. Her face in profile was still remarkable. The architecture of it had always been good, and good architecture, unlike good looks, tends to improve with time rather than diminish. She was very still. Miss Marple had known her for 60 years, allowing for long gaps and the way lives diverge after 30, and she had rarely seen her still. Movement had always been Honoria's mode. She thought on her feet, planned while walking, made decisions the way she rearranged furniture, without hesitation, occasionally without warning. This stillness was not composure. It was the stillness of a person who has been moving under a very heavy weight for a very long time and has, for a moment, simply stopped. "Inspector Foster will want to speak to you," Miss Marple said. "I know." A pause. "Edmund has been with us, had been with us, since 1922. I keep thinking I ought to feel more, and then I think—" She stopped. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That was all. Sometimes the kindest thing was to agree with what had not quite been said, and let the rest stand." She looked at the table beside Honoria's chair. A book, face down. Honoria had always been hard on spines. It drove librarians wild. A cup of cold tea. A small silver-framed photograph of a young man whom Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. Not Robert Ashford, who she had met twice and knew by sight, but someone younger. Someone with Honoria's own eyes, which were a very specific grey-green, the colour of lichen on a north-facing wall. She did not ask about the photograph. "Philip came this morning," Honoria said. "Before I'd even heard, before anyone told me. He came and sat with me." A small sound, not quite a laugh. "He always has, since we were young people. He simply arrives. Before you need him, and after you need him, and precisely when you need him. He is a good friend, said Miss Marple. He is the best friend I have ever had. She said it with the plainness of a very old fact. The best friend anyone could have. Miss Marple's hands were folded in her lap, and she pressed her thumbs together, a private habit, a way of steadying the thought. She thought of Mrs. Pinkerton, not as a distraction, but as a key finding the shape of its lock. "Honoria," she said, "do you remember I once told you about Mrs. Pinkerton? The draper's wife? Or, no, the one with the garden. The one with the garden. Her husband, Gerald Pinkerton, was seen 3 times leaving the Fordyce house at odd hours. Everyone in the village thought they knew what that meant. It seemed—" She stopped, corrected herself. The word was forbidden, and old habits required discipline. It was the obvious conclusion, but what he was actually doing was paying off a debt that Mrs. Fordyce's late husband had owed to him, quietly, in installments, because he was too proud to make a formal claim, and she was too proud to receive one. Honoria looked at her. "What is your point, Jane?" "Only that loyalty," said Miss Marple, "is very easily mistaken for something more complicated or something less clean, depending on where you are standing." A long silence. The fire shifted. "Edmund knew something," Honoria said at last. Her voice was very level, the level of a surface that has been carefully smoothed. "He has always known something. That is, that was the nature of the arrangement." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I rather thought it might be." She did not ask what the something was. Not yet. There was a temperature in the room, not unpleasant, but precise, and she had learned that pushing certain questions too early was like pulling pastry before it had rested. The whole thing tore. She finished her tea, cold, but she did not mention it, and rose to leave. At the door she paused and turned, as she sometimes did, with a pleasantly vague expression that meant something quite specific. "Dr. Winterton," she said, "does he still keep that beautiful carriage rug? The one his wife brought back from Edinburgh. MacGregor tartan, I think. He showed it to me once, years ago. It was on the armchair in his sitting room." Honoria's face did not change in any gross way, but her hands, still folded in her lap, pressed together briefly, a fraction of a second, and then relaxed. "I really couldn't say," she said. "I haven't been to his house recently." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and went out into the grey morning. Chapter 6. The kitchen garden inspector Foster had finished with Mrs. Hadley by 2 o'clock, and Mrs. Hadley emerged from the morning room with the expression of a woman who has been thoroughly wrung and hung out. Crisp. Miss Marple intercepted her in the back passage with a cup of tea. She had made it herself, which was not difficult, and which produced in Mrs. Hadley the slightly startled reaction of a woman unaccustomed to being the recipient of small kindnesses in her own kitchen. "Thank you, ma'am." She took the cup, wrapped both hands around it. Her hands were reddened at the knuckles, the skin dry and tight, from a lifetime of cold water and work. She held the warmth of the cup with the specific gratitude of someone who has been cold for a long time without mentioning it. Miss Marple sat across the table and said, "The biscuits on the tray last night, what sort were they?" Mrs. Hadley blinked. Whatever she had expected, it was not biscuits. Digestives, same as always. He was particular about digestives. And 2. Always 2. Had he eaten dinner last night? He did not come to the dining room. He ate at his desk. I sent a tray at 6. He often worked late when the valuer was in the house. Something about the inventory records. Miss Marple considered this. A man who had eaten at 6 and then had a full tea tray sent at 9, which he had not touched, was either dead by 9 or engaged in something sufficiently consuming that he had forgotten hunger entirely. In her experience, neither possibility was restful. "Mrs. Hadley," she said, "the kitchen garden key. Had it been borrowed recently? By anyone you know of?" The housekeeper's hands tightened on the cup, just fractionally. The same involuntary tightening Miss Marple had observed in people who had decided to tell the truth and found that the decision did not, in fact, make truth any easier to produce. "Mr. Bellamy asked about it," she said. Yesterday afternoon, he asked whether there was a way from the garden into the back lane. He said he wanted to post a letter without going around the front. And you told him. I told him the key was on the board. I didn't think anything of it. Her voice had gone a shade flatter, the tone of hindsight. He went out. He came back in through the front door about 20 minutes later. I saw him from the hall. He never returned the key. He didn't post a letter, said Miss Marple. Or if he did, that was not his primary purpose. She set down her own cup and went to look at the keyboard again. The brass hooks, the white china labels, the single gap, KG. She put one fingertip very lightly to the empty hook. The brass was cold and slightly rough, worn smooth at the top by years of fingers lifting and replacing the same key. She went out through the back door, across the kitchen garden. October had done its work on the kitchen garden methodically. The beds were cleared and covered, the frames stacked, the espaliered pear trees against the south wall stripped and angular. Her shoes pressed into the gravel path and then onto the grass that grew between the central beds, and the grass was wet and the cold of it came through the leather immediately. She crossed to the north wall gate and pushed it open. The lane beyond was narrow, unmade, bordered on the far side by the hedge of the home wood. She stood in the gateway and looked both ways. To the right, the lane curved toward the village, toward the post office, the pub, the road that led eventually to the houses of people who had reasons to walk this way. To the left, the lane ran straight for perhaps 200 yards and ended at the gate of a property she recognized by its fence. White-painted wooden palings, very neat, with a rambler rose cut back hard for winter. Dr. Winterton's house. She stood in the cold gateway for a moment, one hand on the stone of the wall, feeling the chill of it, the damp coming through the lichen that clung to the surface in grey-green patches, and she thought, of course it was this simple. The simplest things always were, and the simplest things were always the last ones you let yourself see, because you spent so long hoping they would turn out to be complicated. She heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her, and turned. Charles Bellamy was walking toward her from the direction of the hall, his overcoat buttoned against the cold, his hands in his pockets. He stopped when he saw her standing in the gateway. They looked at each other. "Mr. Bellamy," said Miss Marple, "were you in this garden last evening?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at the gateway, at the lane, at the direction of Dr. Winterton's fence, and she watched him calculate something. Not whether to lie, she thought. The calculation was different, more like a man deciding how much of the truth was safe to carry, and whether he was strong enough to put some of it down. "I came to speak to him," he said. "Pargeter, through the kitchen garden. I didn't want to come through the front." He turned the collar of his overcoat up against the wind. "I didn't want anyone to see me. I needed to speak to him privately." "About?" A very long pause. The gate swung gently between them. "He was my father," Charles Bellamy said. "Or he told my mother he was, which might not be the same thing." Miss Marple received this without visible response. She had developed, over many decades, the ability to receive large pieces of information in small containers. She said, "And did you speak to him?" "I knocked on the library window. It was how he'd told me to come, in his letter, the letter that brought me down here in the first place." But there was no light, no answer. He looked at his hands, still in his pockets. "I waited perhaps 10 minutes, then I went away." "What time?" 8:30, perhaps 8:45, through the gate. "Yes." He hesitated. "I pulled it to behind me. I'm quite sure I pulled it too." "I don't know why someone came after you," said Miss Marple, "and did not close it." She turned back to look down the lane, the white palings of Dr. Winterton's fence, the late roses cut back to bare canes, very grey against the grey afternoon sky, waiting. She turned away from the gate, back toward the house. "Thank you, Mr. Bellamy," she said. "I think you should tell Inspector Foster exactly what you've told me, about being here, about the time, the window, all of it. Will it?" He stopped, started again. "Will it make trouble for me?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but silence will certainly make more." She left him standing at the gate, and walked back across the kitchen garden, and the cold came through her shoes, and the grey afternoon pressed down over everything, and she felt, not excitement, not the brisk satisfaction of a puzzle clarifying, but the heavy, tired recognition of a shape she had hoped not to find. She had been hoping, she realized, that it was Marjorie's debts, or James Ashford's photographs, or Mrs. Hadley's pilfered silver, something manageable, something with clean edges, not this, not Philip. Chapter 7. Photographs. Inspector Foster was not, Miss Marple reflected, a stupid man. He simply had the disadvantage of looking where the evidence pointed, which was a perfectly reasonable approach to a murder investigation, and also, occasionally, the approach most likely to lead you firmly in the wrong direction. The evidence, by Saturday morning, pointed at James Ashford. This was because James Ashford had, in Edmund Pargeter's locked desk drawer, opened under the inspector's supervision, with a key found on Edmund's body, a manila envelope containing 4 photographs of a young woman named Gloria Marsh, who was 19 years old and performed at the Tivoli Theatre in Lewisham, and was, by any reasonable assessment, entirely unsuitable as the future Lady Ashford by the standards of people who still thought in those terms, which Edmund Pargeter demonstrably had. There was also a letter in Edmund's hand, not yet sent, addressed to Lady Ashford, which described Miss Marsh's existence and James Ashford's intentions in terms of considerable precision and no generosity whatsoever. James Ashford, confronted with this, went very red and then very still, the stillness of a young man discovering that the thing he most feared has already happened, which produces a particular quality of silence, like bread just taken from the oven, hot, dense, finished. "I knew he had them," James said. "He told me he had them. He said if the sale went through and I received my inheritance, he'd want a consideration." "He was blackmailing you," said Inspector Foster. "He called it a—" "Yes." The young man's jaw tightened. "Yes, he was. And you went to the library Thursday night to—" "I went to tell him I wouldn't pay, that he could do whatever he liked." He looked up, and his expression was not guilt, but a species of angry exhaustion. "I was in the library at 8 o'clock. We argued. I left. He was alive when I left him, standing behind his desk, very calm, which was the most infuriating thing about him. He was always calm." Miss Marple, sitting in her corner of the morning room with her knitting in her lap, she had retrieved it from her room that morning, feeling the need of something to do with her hands, noted all of this with the portion of her attention not occupied by the question of whether Marjorie Ashford, who sat beside her son throughout this interview, had known about the blackmail. Marjorie's hands were in her lap, flat and still. That told her nothing. She watched for something else. The movement of the eye, the small adjustments of posture that people made when they were managing information they were not releasing. When Inspector Foster mentioned the gambling debts, he had done his work, clearly, or Crisp had. Marjorie made no movement at all, which was itself a movement, of a kind. A woman who genuinely has nothing to hide does not receive bad news with total stillness. Stillness is the posture of someone who has rehearsed. But the gambling debts, the photographs, the blackmail, these were not the shape Miss Marple was looking at. These were the other things in the room, the things that filled it and caught the eye and drew attention precisely because they were large and obvious and unmistakably there. She had learned, over a long life, to distrust the obvious, not out of contrarianism, but because the obvious thing was almost always the thing placed in front of you, and someone had placed it there. She knitted, and she thought about the kitchen garden gate. Chapter 8. The carriage rug. She walked to Dr. Winterton's house on Saturday afternoon. She had rung first. She was not so lost in abstraction as to arrive unannounced, and in any case, she wanted him to know she was coming. That was the point. She wanted him to have the time that a telephone call provided. 12 minutes, she estimated, between the call and her arrival at his gate, and she wanted to see what he did with it. What he did with it was nothing, or nothing visible. He met her at the door himself, His housekeeper had Saturdays, apparently, wearing a cardigan over his shirt. Very ordinary, and he showed her into the sitting room with the courtesy of a man entirely at ease. He offered tea. She accepted. The sitting room was a room she had been in before, though not recently. Once, years ago, at a Christmas gathering she could only partially reconstruct. It was a careful room. The room of a man who had lived alone for 20 years and had come to an understanding with his own solitude. Books on every wall. A good clock on the mantelpiece. French, she thought. A writing desk near the window. A low table with a pipe rack. Unused for years by the look of it, kept out of habit or sentiment. 2 armchairs facing the fire. She sat in one. He sat in the other and poured tea from a pot already made. He had had it ready, which told her he had done something with those 12 minutes after all. The armchair across from her had a cushion on it, dark blue wool, set square against the back. The armrests were slightly faded. It was clearly his chair, the one he used, the arrangement of it in relation to the lamp and the fire making this self-evident. It was the chair of a man who spent his evenings reading. There was nothing on it but the cushion. Miss Marple accepted her tea, held the cup. The china was thin and very smooth, the warmth of the tea coming through it immediately, and looked at the chair, and looked at the slightly faded patches on the armrests where the fabric had been pressed, repeatedly and over a long time, by the same weight. The armrests were bare. "Philip," she said, without preamble, "where is the McGregor tartan rug?" His hands did not move. His face did not change. The clock ticked. "I wondered," he said, "whether you would ask that. I'm asking it. I burned it." He set his own cup down very carefully, on the exact center of the saucer. "In the boiler, Friday morning." Before anyone was up. Miss Marple looked at him, this lean, dry, steady man of 78, with his steady hands and his careful room, and felt the specific weight that descends when a thing you hoped might be otherwise turns out to be exactly what it was. She had liked him for 30 years. That was the difficulty. He was the sort of person one liked, genuinely, without effort, the way one likes a reliable chair or a well-made window. He was good. She was entirely certain he was good, and she was entirely certain he had killed Edmund Pargeter, and these two certainties sat in her chest with the uncomfortable proximity of things that were not supposed to occupy the same space. "He threatened James," she said. "The photographs. He threatened Honoria." His voice was very quiet, not flat, not without feeling, but controlled the way a good fire is controlled, banked, directed, hot. He had done so for 20 years, on and off, small amounts usually, manageable. But the sale made him bold. He wrote to her last month, a larger sum, or he would tell James the truth about his father. Silence. Miss Marple set down her cup. She looked at the fire. James's father, she said, was not Gerald Ashford. He picked up his cup again and put it down without drinking. Gerald Ashford knew. He was a better man than most people gave him credit for, Gerald. He chose Honoria, knowing. He raised the boy. But Edmund knew too. He'd been Edmund's leverage since 1941. A breath. James doesn't know. He must not know. Honoria would be destroyed by it. Not the secret itself. She has carried that for 50 years, and she is stronger than most people realize. But James knowing, James looking at her differently. He paused. That would destroy her. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, long enough that the clock ticked through several measured beats. She thought of Honoria's face that morning. The grey stillness of it. The hands pressed together, briefly, at the question about the rug. She thought of Philip Winterton, arriving before the news came, sitting beside her before anyone had told her, being there, as he had always been there, in the shapeless, inexplicable way of a person whose loyalty has no vocabulary because it has never needed one. "You came through the kitchen garden," she said. "You knew about the gate. You are so near. Through the lane. I have a key." A pause. "Had a key. It is at the bottom of the well in my garden. Charles Bellamy had already been and gone. I didn't know that. I saw the library window dark, and I thought perhaps Edmund was elsewhere in the house. Then I tried the green door, and it opened. His voice did not waver. He was at the fire. He turned when I came in. He was not afraid of me. He never thought. He stopped. Enough. Miss Marple did not need the rest of it. She could assemble the rest from what was already there. The candlestick taken from the mantelpiece, the careful wrapping in the tartan rug to manage what she did not want to think about, the exit through the garden gate in the dark, and she found she did not want it spoken aloud. Spoken aloud, it became something different, something harder and more permanent. Left in the air between them, it was still just barely a thing that had not quite solidified. She picked up her cup. The tea was cooling now, the warmth in the china subsiding, and she drank what remained. "Philip," she said. He looked at her. "I am very sorry," she said. "I am very sorry that it came to this." He looked at the fire for a long time. Outside, the October wind pressed against the window. She could feel the draft of it across the backs of her hands, and the light was going from the afternoon, the grey of it deepening toward dark. "Yes," he said, "so am I." Chapter 9. The Conversation. She told Inspector Foster that she had visited Dr. Winterton for tea and found him well, and that she did not believe Charles Bellamy had anything material to contribute to the investigation beyond his account of the library window, which he subsequently gave. She said this on Sunday morning, in the morning room, with her hands folded and her expression that of a woman reporting something entirely unremarkable. Foster looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Marple," he said, "is there anything else you think I should know?" She considered this with what she hoped was appropriate gravity. It was not a small question. It did not deserve a small answer, which was precisely why she was not going to give him one at all. "I think," she said carefully, "that Edmund Pargeter was not a good man. I think he made a great many people very unhappy over a very long time, and that the person who killed him did so out of something rather more complicated than malice." She paused. "I think the candlestick will not be found. I think the inquest will return an open verdict, and I think—" She stopped, adjusted. The word had nearly come, the forbidden word, the easy word. "I think that may be the most just outcome available to everyone." Foster was quiet for a moment. He was not, she thought again, a stupid man. "You're telling me," he said, "to let it alone. I'm telling you nothing of the sort. I am an elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. I am telling you that I found the hall very cold, and that I am looking forward to my own fireside." He let her go. Chapter 10. The Last Train. The inquest was held on Tuesday. Open verdict. Miss Marple did not attend. She was not required to, and she found inquests distressing in a way she had never managed to make entirely rational. Not the legal proceedings, which were orderly enough, but the way they reduced a person to the narrowest possible account of themselves. The time of death, the cause of death, the manner of death, as if a human life were a ledger entry and the only question worth asking was how it closed. Edmund Pargeter had been many things. A blackmailer, certainly. A careful and methodical man. A man who had looked at James Ashford across a dinner table with the expression of someone turning a key. A man who had, for 31 years, kept the Ashford estate running with a competence no one had thought to be grateful for, because competence is the thing you only notice when it stops. She did not mourn him, but she thought about him, which was not the same as mourning and was perhaps, in some ways, more honest. She packed her bag on Wednesday morning. The housemaid, whose name she had finally learned was Doris, carried it to the hall. Mrs. Hadley stood at the kitchen door and said goodbye, with the economy of a woman who considers goodbyes wasteful but makes them anyway out of respect for the person leaving. James Ashford shook her hand and said he hoped she would come again. He said it with the automatic politeness of his grandmother's training, and also, she thought, with some genuine feeling beneath it. He was not, in the end, a bad young man. He was a young man who had been frightened and had stood his ground, which was more than could be said for several people Miss Marple had known with twice his advantages. Marjorie Ashford did not appear. Honoria walked with her across the park, insisting, despite the cold, despite the grey weight of the morning, and they went slowly, as old women go when they are not in a hurry and know they are not in a hurry. The park was very quiet. The rooks were in the elms at the far end, making their bleak, practical noise. At the gate, Honoria took her hand. "Jane," she said, "Philip died last night." Miss Marple went still, in his sleep. Honoria's voice was, she could not describe it exactly, the voice of a woman who has been told something that is the worst possible thing, and also, in some manner she could not quite name, a relief. "His housekeeper found him this morning. The doctor says his heart." Miss Marple thought of a lean, dry man of 78, sitting in his chair by the fire, steady as he had always been, making whatever decision he had made. She thought of the well in his garden. She thought of his hands, the knuckles enlarged, the skin worn, turning a felt hat brim round and round and round. He was a good man, she said. She said it plainly, because it was plain, because complicated people could still be good, and she refused to let complications swallow the fact of it. "Yes," said Honoria. Her grip on Miss Marple's hand tightened briefly. The cold, firm grip of their first meeting, repeated. "He was." She released her hand. She did not say anything else. She turned and walked back across the grey park, toward the grey hall, under the grey October sky, and her back was very straight, and she did not look around. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, Doris had carried it this far, bless her, and walked down the lane toward the village. Gone. At the station, waiting for the 11:15 to London, she sat on the platform bench and opened her bag to find her ticket. Her fingers found something else first, a small, cold, heavy thing, pressed into the outer pocket of the bag. She drew it out. The brass watch chain. Edmund Pargeter's, thick as a finger, looped once around itself, cold from the bag's interior, and slightly rough in the hand. She turned it over. No note. No explanation. Someone had placed it there. Mrs. Hadley, she thought, or possibly Philip himself, before Saturday evening, before whatever he had decided, and she could not know which, and it did not, in the end, matter. She held it in her palm for a moment, the weight of it, the cold of it, the 31 years of it, and she thought, I will give this to Honoria. Not now. Later, when the estate is sold and the distance gives everything a cleaner shape. I will send it, with a short note, and she will know what it means without my having to say it. The train came in with a great rush of steam and warm air. She put the chain away. She picked up her bag. She settled into her seat and folded her hands in her lap and looked out of the window as Ashford Hall's chimneys, visible above the tree line, grey against grey, slipped away behind her and were gone. She did not take out her knitting. She simply sat and watched the fields go by and allowed herself to feel, not the clean, completed satisfaction she had sometimes felt at the end of other cases, but something harder and more necessary, the weight of a thing correctly done that could never quite be called right, and the knowledge that this weight did not go away, and that carrying it was, in the end, simply part of the work. The train ran on.